Hello and welcome to Race Control Redux episode 9. In this episode we'll be tackling the suspension. This is going to be a long one.
That's what she said!
We'll start with some theory. A car suspension is primarily comprised of a spring and a damper or two, along with various other bits and bobs that usually make sure the weight is distributed in one way or another depending on the car. Let's start with the springs and let's keep it simple while we're at it. The job of a spring is to keep the car off the ground. When racing, it also has to do this while being squished in all kinds of ways by powerful aero packages, curbs and various other quirks of whatever it happens to be driving on. As a general rule, you want this to be as soft as you can set it without bottoming out at any point on the track. However, you also have some creative license in this regard. Softer springs generally make for more grip, so you could go a little softer than normal on one end than the other if you wanted, and then raise the ride height to stop it bottoming out. We'll be covering ride height in a bit more detail later. Back to the spring rates, people also have their personal preference as to what they like, and some people have genuine trouble driving anything that isn't stiffened up.
That's what she said!
Bear in mind that a softer car will also be less responsive to initial inputs, and cars that rely on aerodynamics will also benefit from a stiffer suspension since it keeps the ride height within working parameters. If it's your first foray into suspension setups, then you'll notice the front and rear suspension usually aren't the same stiffness. This is perfectly normal as the standard suspension is usually tuned around whatever quirks the car has to begin with, and many other things such as aero balance and weight bias can affect how the suspension is set up to begin with. Now for the mythical magic that is the damper system. Also known as a shock absorber, the damper is a secondary tube, or tubes, that only allow a certain amount of force to travel through the suspension, and on the majority of racing dampers you can adjust the maximum force for going both up and down the travel of the suspension. This all sounds rather abstract, so let's take a scenario. If you had a car with no dampers on it at all, the car would be on springs alone and the vertical motion of each spring would have no damping whatsoever, so it would just bounce up and down constantly. It would be funny, but the weight on the tyres would be constantly changing as each corner of the car rises and falls, making for big changes in grip and an unconscious driver. The dampers are put in place to negate this motion, and while it's doing that, it can do it in particular ways that modify the car's behaviour. The important part of a damper setup is to try and have enough damping that the car isn't bouncing excessively, but not so much that the suspension can't move effectively. The dampers restrict motion, so by stiffening the dampers you're effectively stiffening the suspension in whichever direction the damper applies. You'll have 4 settings to adjust in the dampers, and we'll start with the slow settings. These are usually measured in Newton meters per second, which basically means force applied. The slow settings define the force applied to restrict movement when the force applied by the car's movement is below a certain threshold, which changes depending on the type of damper in the car. This is where we get into telemetry territory, so for now we'll keep it simple and say that the slow damper settings come into play with slow movement, so general body movement under accelerating and braking, as well as entrance and exit of corners where the weight is shifting about. With this in mind, you should adjust these when the car is having trouble doing any of these things. The bump setting defines how much restriction is placed on the suspension corner when it is being compressed, so under braking for a front damper and under acceleration for a rear damper. A higher setting means a more restrictive damper essentially, so it has the same effect as a stiffer suspension in terms of driving behaviour. Next up is rebound, and this is pretty self-explanatory. It defines how much the suspension is restricted in going back to its original state. In less abstract terms, it's defining how much force is going on the tyre when the car is moving away from the ground. Again, the slow setting only affects basic acceleration and deceleration as well as the cornering stuff. So with rebound you're talking about how much the front wheels are pushing into the ground when accelerating and how much the rear wheels are trying to stay in contact when the car is braking. This is especially useful in trail braking situations where the rear is braking out. You can decrease this setting and it will allow the tyre to get back to the road faster, and keep your contact patch high, therefore helping with preventing oversteer. Bear in mind though that this is similar to increasing the deceleration lock on a differential. You'll help with some things, but it will promote understeer in other situations. Now we've got the fast settings. One way of thinking about these is that if the slow setting affects how the car's body moves, the fast setting affects how each wheel moves. These are primarily for dealing with bumps, and as a general rule, the main adjustment you should think about is lowering the rebound setting on your rear dampers for excessively bumpy tracks. If you're going over a fast bumpy section and your rear skips out and causes you to spin, then you can decrease this setting to again allow the suspension to move toward the road more, and therefore keeping it in contact with the road and increasing grip at the rear over these surfaces and keeping it in line a little more. On the flip side, if you find yourself hopping and understeering heavily over bumps, then you can either increase this setting a little or decrease the front damper to keep the fronts on the track. The bump setting basically says how much the wheel in question soaks up any bumps that come along. A low setting allows the suspension to compress to its fullest potential under a sudden force, which basically means that none of the energy is dissipated into the car. Setting this high restricts the suspension's ability to contract, which then results in more energy transferring to the chassis under bumps. How you want to set this up is entirely up to you, but take into account that setting this too low will mean that the damper cannot do its job of damping down on the natural oscillations of the spring, so it will bounce all over the place and be generally unpleasant, not to mention the fact that your grip will be constantly changing. One thing to note, however, is that a harder fast bump not only means that more energy is going through the chassis, but also through the tyre itself as well. This will cause it to flex a little more than usual, and as a result it will become hotter. One last point on the dampers is that there's a bit of bleed between the fast and slow settings, so by changing one, you'll be changing the other a little bit as well. You might not even notice it, just something to consider when making any drastic changes. That's the dampers covered, mostly. Not so bad, is it? Now for the bump stops. Some series allow a piece of rubber to be placed in the suspension's length of travel. This piece provides an extra resistance in the last few millimeters of the suspension's range, which allows for teams to run softer suspensions that would usually be possible, with the bump stops coming in at the last second to stop the car running aground. What you'll be adjusting is how big these bump stops are, and although ideally you wouldn't use them at all, if you do happen to need them, then you want the absolute minimum required to keep the car off the ground. That being said, this method isn't particularly progressive, as you'll effectively be switching between two different strengths of suspension in areas where the bump stops are needed, so you may also wish to try much larger bump stops for a more progressive feel. If you want to get a little fancy with it, however, you can do the same as with the ride height and incorporate rake. Rake is an aerodynamic trick used by teams to get extra downforce. It's a rudimentary form of ground effect, which creates an area of low pressure beneath the car by having the rear sit slightly higher than the front. This will also create a slight drag, so how much you do this is up to you. That being said, about 20mm difference between front and rear seems to be the point of diminishing returns for most vehicles, so experiment with values above that before taking it to a race. Also, the aerodynamic centre of the car may not be the physical centre, so adjusting rake may give oversteer or understeer depending on the particular car. As a general rule, however, it'll cause oversteer in extreme rakes, simply because the rear is higher and therefore has more leverage in a corner. Going back to ride height, you generally want to keep your centre of gravity as low as possible, so as usual with suspension, you want to get down as far as possible without scraping the ground. As I'm sure you're beginning to work out, suspension setup is a juggling act between getting a car soft enough to grip up, stiff enough to not wobble, and low enough to keep composed. Everyone has their own theories as to how to balance these out, but before I leave you to the wolves, there's one more thing to cover, and that's the sway bars. Sway bars, or anti-roll bars, are actually pretty simple. They link the two sides of the car suspension together on each axle and apply a certain force to keep them level with each other, and it's this force that you adjust in the setup menu. The general rule, once again, is that you want these to be pretty soft, but as cars get lower, you'll find these values need to increase in order to be effective, especially on things like single-seaters where they can be many orders of magnitude stronger than anything you would find on a normal sports car. The main use for sway bars, however, is balance. They aren't really necessary on stiff cars where the suspension is stopping the car rolling too much anyway, but they're really good for adjusting a car's entry and exit balance because they can adjust the size of the contact patch of each tyre with a very high level of precision. Called the roll bias, this value describes the balance of the sway bars between the front and rear axle. A forward roll bias is common on front-wheel drive cars and features a soft front sway bar with a reasonably stiff rear sway bar. This means that on the entry of a corner, the rear inside tyre has a very small contact patch, or sometimes lifts it completely, allowing the rear to pivot around and gives the car better turning. Some rear-wheel drive cars have this as well, but nowhere near as severe. On the other side of the coin is a rearward bias, which means a soft rear sway bar and a stiff front sway bar. This means that the car will stay pretty level on entry, but on the power, the inside front will lift up. This is common in cars where the differential is either forbidden from being modified or isn't capable of handling the power of the car on its own, and enforces understeer on the power, which allows for better controllability in faster cars. I think that's all for Race Control Redux episode 9. Suspension setup is quite possibly one of the most complex aspects of setting up a car, so if you can get around at the head all this, then well, I don't know. Good luck, and thanks for watching.